To go. So we got the recording thing done. Very good. Okay, so today I'm going to talk a bit about behavioral strategies for modifying delusional beliefs. I started with the idea that I was going to talk about behavioral experiments, and I will a little bit, but once I get into this literature and the reading of it, it's pretty involved. So what I want you to think about in terms of behavioral strategies, you can go from very simple to much more complex. And what I'm going to try to do today is be more on the simple end and dig in a little bit and give some ideas and some examples. And then, we can kind of build from there in terms of discussions, and then future, trainings, we can go a little deeper if that makes sense. Okay, so the first slide is really just about and it may be self-evident, but experiencing the change. When they look at the literature on CBT, and they did a study, Weeks did a meta-analysis on the effectiveness of CBTp, and it was effective. And when they broke it down into cognitive and behavioral strategies, it turned out the ones that were more action-oriented or behavioral tended to have bigger, kind of more impact, if you will. And it kind of makes sense if you think about anxiety disorders and things like fear of public speaking. You could talk to someone about, maybe irrational thoughts or catastrophic thinking, but really the impact is going to come when the person actually goes in and provides a presentation or speaks in class and gets some feedback with some exposure. So really the essence of that slide is the importance of doing something. The other sort of lead up slide to talking about this stuff is the idea that delusional beliefs are a lot like anxiety disorders, in the sense that the belief usually comes when there's an intensified kind of activated state that happens, and some of it has to do with dopamine and then anxiety and other kinds of things. So it's often maintained by that. And then behavioral avoidance is another part that also sort of maintains that process. So the person who develops the beliefs also develops behaviors that kind of prevents them from looking for disconfirming evidence. Same kind of thing works with anxiety disorders. If you avoid public speaking, your anxiety increases at the next thought of actually speaking in public. The way we work with it is very similar: small tests and graded exposure. So those who have worked with anxiety are probably familiar with exposure ladders, kind of hierarchies of things to kind of get exposed to. Same kind of principle applies here. Now, in terms of working with delusions, there's kind of an indirect approach, and then there is a more direct approach. The indirect is kind of, I don't want to call this general CBT stuff, but it's kind of the idea that if the delusions, you're not making much, progress there, often just increasing behaviors that are valuable or meaningful can have an effect on a person's belief system. And so the idea is starting with that recovery mindset, this belief that people can often do more than they think they can, believe and affirm them, starting with their interests, values, their strengths, develop a plan, empower them with choices, working on small steps together. And as people do things, no matter how small, they tend to have the capacity to think differently about themselves. And so then the last piece on there is always doing that metacognitive sort of self-reflective checking. Like, what does it say about you that you were able to do this? I had a client who really liked baking, but just wasn't doing things due to a lot of negative symptoms. And as she began to do little bits of cooking and baking and sharing those stories, it really helped the way that she thought about herself. Didn't change the delusional belief so much, but did change the belief about herself as someone who could do valuable, meaningful things. So that's always one approach that we can take in terms of working with individuals on any kind of issue, but including delusions. All right, so in terms of getting to the issues related to delusions or a more direct approach, there's kind of three categories, and this comes from the Combs article and the Hagen article that are referenced below. So one thing that you can do when a person has a belief, let's say about telepathy or reading minds or something like that, you can certainly look at the research on that. What do we know in the literature about whatever the particular issue or challenge is there? Another level of experiment or research, if you will, is observational. And this is a little less on the intensity thing, but it's really just kind of observing things, but observing carefully. And so there's a couple ways that this can play out. This is and you've probably heard this in our trainings, if somebody's really avoiding eye contact for fear of being watched all the time, a simple behavioral test is, why don't we just observe, lift our eyes up and just pay attention in different situations? What is actually happening? All right. You're partially testing the belief, but it's a fairly straightforward, low risk kind of behavior. A third sort of observational or checking in one is a survey kind of a way that you can approach things. And one thing that you can do is individuals often have a very limited view of themselves. And sometimes it's helpful just to survey them about what others think about them. Val has a nice example with a client she worked with where the client surveyed family members and some friends and got some different data about, how people saw that person and positive information that they didn't consider. So that could be a survey of sorts. And you can also survey other topics. The third category is more the traditional behavioral experiment, which is kind of like a scientific experiment, if you will. So we have a hypothesis and we're going to test it. If I step outside of this door, the ceiling's going to fall because the voices tell me that. So we could test that belief if we could take a step outside the door, would be a simple example of something along those lines. So those are the three big categories. And the idea through each of these is always linking a person's actions with what they're thinking about and helping them get some clarity about that. All right, so how do we set these up? First thing, we want to make sure the relationship is pretty strong to start with. You don't jump typically right into a behavioral experiment, but you usually want to explore a person's understanding, and this goes to the maintenance formulation. What are those thought, feeling, behavior connections that are going on, and unpacking those to kind of pay attention to what you might be able to work on and check. And typically we start with this exploring the belief, looking for areas of doubt, looking for where there may be some inconsistencies, where the person may be open to information, things like that. In the literature, there's this thing called a reaction to hypothetical contradiction. And this is kind of the idea that you could throw out like a hypothetical and just to see how they would respond to it, and as a way to see how flexible they are. So an example I use is, if a person believes there's a chip in their brain and you said, well, what if we had a test that could tell 100% whether or not there was something like that, positioned in your brain, with the advanced technology, how would that affect your belief? And if they say it would have no effect because it would be fixed, it would be rigged, then you kind of have this indication that it doesn't make sense to go to that level because they're resisting that so strongly right there. And then you would work on the edges. What is the effect of having this belief? Well, I'm dizzy or I feel anxious or whatever. I wonder if we could work on that part of the belief and maybe test out some of those things. Then you could work at that level. So anyway, using those skills, guided discovery, looking at alternatives, and that's where it gets you to the point of figuring out how do you figure out what you're going to test. So the basic steps are pretty straightforward for those, who've had some, psychology in terms of doing research experiments. It's kind of the idea of like, what's the thought or the belief that we're going to test? And the idea is to try to be as specific as you can with that. And then looking for specific predictions, what are the observables that would happen if you did X, Y, or Z. And the key is that whatever test you do is it needs to be meaningful to the person. The other piece that's important as you're looking at developing tests and predictions is asking those questions. What would it mean if it doesn't happen the way that you think? All right. And this, we used to talk a fair amount about, if a person was wondering about whether they heard voices or not, using an audio recorder to actually record the times when they're hearing voices that others might not be. And then the question would be, what does it mean if the voices do not show up on the tape? What if they show up on the tape? What does that mean? What if they don't show up on the audio? And really important to kind of explore that, because if the answer is, oh, that will adjust my belief and I believe this and this, okay, that's one thing. But if they're like, well, that means I'm crazy, might as well give up, it's terrible to have that, then you need to be doing a lot more work around normalization, destigmatizing, things like that. So that part's always important. So then walking through the steps again, you're going to conduct the experiment and then review the outcome in light of the prediction that they made. This is a form that we can also send to you, but it's in the slide deck, as you can see here. And this is from Morrison's book, but it really just organizes the way to do the test. What belief am I checking? How much do I believe it? And then different ways, like here's how I might test it. And then you kind of make predictions and adjustments as you go along, because there's likely to be challenges. And this is where it gets in the weeds a little bit that we don't have quite time to kind of filter through all the weeds that go with it. But you want to be able to make the test something that the person will afterwards be able to think maybe a little differently about the belief that they hold, whether it's about a voice or a persecution or something along those lines. All right, checking my time here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a couple of examples. One's kind of a textbook, and two others are from clients, and they're not in the deep dive, like all the complexity, but just to give you a sense of how to think about it. So this is from Hazel Nelson, really excellent book on CBT for psychosis. And the common experience where individuals feel that others can read their mind. All right. And so what she starts with in her recommendations are some inquiries. Again, that exploratory stuff. Can you read other people's minds? Do you think I can read your mind? Can other people read one another's minds? And so kind of opening up different possibilities where there could be doubt, like, well, yeah, I can't read other people's mind. And if they ask the therapist, the therapist, would say, well, I can assure you, I cannot read your mind. You can ask, do you believe that? Does that make sense? And it gets them questioning and doubting it a little bit. And so this is sort of that exploratory approach with it. And then she kind of outlines different reality tests that you can do at different levels of intensity, depending upon the person and what would influence them. One could be a direct survey asking others if they can read your mind. Now, again, that hinges on, whether the person trusts that the other person's giving accurate information, but you could certainly survey that and see, and ask the person, would that make any difference in how much you believe this? A second one would be to conduct a telepathy experiment, where you would have the person who believes that their mind is being read, for example, come up with a 4-digit number and ask the therapist or family and friends, and this is where family and friends can kind of come into some of these, to, be able to, come up with a 4-digit number. Now, again, the likelihood of that happening by chance is very, very small. And you have to be very specific. It has to be 4 digits in the order of the digits, just in case there's some, mixing up of the numbers that might inadvertently confirm the belief. But that would be another way that you can check it. All the way down to more kind of stringent tests where you might say, what if we went into the lobby and, if the idea is people can read your thoughts, if you send an urgent message like fire or watch out, somebody's right behind you, we would expect they would react, right? And so then you can kind of make a little experiment where you go into a lobby and you have certain thoughts like that. And then you come back after you observe what happens, then you come back and kind of review the evidence for it. Another one that you said you could do is to have a true message where you literally have $10 in your pocket and say, I'll give this $10 to whoever asks, in whatever, you have to ask in a very unique and specific way. Not just like look at you or not or whatever. And that's where the specifics become really important. So that's an example of different ways that you can kind of begin to plan the test. The important part is that it's very specific, it's collaborative, the person feels safe but challenged. Val often talks about creating safe emergencies, and that's kind of a good way to think about it. Let's test this in a safe enough way. There's got to be a little bit of risk or it's not going to make much difference. And so you want to be able to set it up in that kind of way. All right. The next example I'm going to give is about a safety behavior, one way to begin to reduce it a little bit. So client that I've worked with is home alone a lot and bored. Here's a voice, which is in the center there, threatening to hurt parents, to kill them. So the belief is if I don't call and check, they will die. There's anger, worry, and fearfulness on the emotion end of it. The behavior is frequently calling family to check to get reassurance. The outcome is the family gets upset, asked to reduce calls and to reduce contact, and then the client is home alone more and bored more. All right, so there's kind of that cycle that's happening. So how do we look at that in a behavioral-ish kind of way? So we kind of break it down by what's the client's value, which is to have a good relationship. We know the distressing event is the voice, and the safety behavior is calling the family many times. And so we examine the belief a little bit. If I don't call, my parents right after the voice, they will be killed. And then we've already done the outcome. So the guided discovery led us to a point where they said, well, how many, I'm wondering if there are times you're not able to call, what happens then, or that they don't pick up. And so the client with some exploration is saying, yeah, they've never been hurt, but I still get these messages. And so I still feel like I need to check. And so then some normalizing comes in and some educating where, we talk about people develop certain behaviors that kind of keeps them safe, but it really doesn't make a huge difference in the actual safety. Morrison in this book talks about using an example of like it's Halloween time. So if you're watching a lot of movies about vampires and become preoccupied with vampires, and then you start putting garlic and holy water and crucifixes in your room, and then you stay there all the time, you're kind of stuck there. And you could ask the client, like, how would you be able to test that to see if that's really protecting them? And often folks will be able to say, well, yeah, I guess they'd have to come out of the room or take away some of those things and see if it was actually so. And so there's some normalizing there. There's a little bit of an example, a metaphor. Metaphors don't work with all, but it is a way to potentially approach folks with it. So the experiment that we ended up deciding upon that was safe enough, but still a little bit risky, was reducing the number of calls to just once per day on a schedule, not right after the voices, defining the concerns about death or grave injury. So it started to change a little bit. And, just kind of monitoring that throughout the week. And so then the objective outcome was that there were no negative events with the parents. We kept track of the subjective experience, and family was less angry about that. Calling less frequently was favorable from a family standpoint. And the client was able to say there's no difference calling one time versus the 5 times in a day. And so the outcome on the belief was the voices lie, but what if something happens? And so then we got into a discussion about kind of worry. what else could be explaining this and kind of normalizing that lots of us have worries that we want reassurance for. And that leads us a little bit closer to maybe thinking about the voice more like a worry and less about something more menacing. All right, so just one example there on the safety behavior. My final example is something that's a little bit, I guess, simpler in a way and often used with depression. This will probably sound familiar. And so again, starting from that recovery focus of value, the client wants to be more fit and lose weight, wanted to join a fitness class, but the blocking belief was really didn't want to get outside, really for fear of getting too worn out, can't do it. And so then that would always block that, I don't want to even try. So with the guided discovery, we really got a sense of how important this is. The value was really around a 7 or an 8, so it was important. And then just wondering how would they be willing to test it out? And what if we, myself and the client, would walk together in different ways, and we would do this as part of our session. And then ultimately from where the client lived, walking towards where this fitness center would be. And we made some predictions, what would you expect at different points on the walk? I'll be too worn out, subjective rating 9 out of a 10, behavior breathless, it would take a long time, up to an hour to do it. And we would have points that we would check, halfway point and at different locations. At the end of the walk, it turned out that the client was able to walk the full distance, the ratings of fatigue were low, and the time to walk was half of what the client had expected. And so then it was just really just reflecting with them. And again, I walked with, so there's, a bit of reassurance and safety there, but we were able to test it out that way. I can walk further than I thought. Then the conclusion was, don't let negative beliefs get in the way. And so then we were able to use that in a family meeting that came up to kind of talk a little bit with mom about encouraging him to do a bit more on his own and kind of sharing like this kind of happens. There's some beliefs that get in the way a bit. How can we help promote a little bit more action? And so that's where we can bring in the family a bit more to kind of help with these things. All right. So in summary, and again, sorry to slam so much information in a short amount of time. The main kind of highlights from my perspective that I was hoping to get across is that strategies that influence behavior, especially behaviors that are meaningful to the person, can be really strong change agents. When thinking about doing these kinds of things, positive indicators are the relationship. You need some stress, right? There needs to be some distress to promote action, some psychological mindedness, and some flexibility. And then if you have supportive families and friends, that can be really helpful when you're expanding out other things the person can do. Contraindications, or the reasons maybe not to go there, would be really low engagement or low alliance, really high levels of activation and agitation. And remember, with psychosis, as with other things, when we're under high stress, we don't think as well, focus as well. So we need to be able to kind of try to bring that down a bit so that the person can kind of internalize the learning that goes with it. Or if there's, and again, another contraindication, if there's just rigid concrete thinking. Start on the edges with very small tests. Be super collaborative each step of the way and very specific in your predictions. And then, of course, consider how the person will view different outcomes, the expected outcome, alternative outcomes, just so that they're always having, because you're also teaching them how to integrate new information, how to find meaning, how to integrate new meaning, and then make steps from there. So that's kind of the overarching bit. Okay, I think I went over a smidge, but close enough to 15, I think. So I will take some questions now. Oh, and then the other thing, the references are all good, but if you needed just one, I would go with the Hagen article, Behavioral Experiments and Treatment of Paranoid Schizophrenia. It's a single case, but it goes over a lot of the essential details. The books are good here, but you got to buy the book. That one you should be able to get online, I think, pretty easily. Let me stop there with one reference. All right, any questions? And I don't want to take too much time with questions, but because we got to get to the case, but any quick questions?